The village of Netherby had long perfected the art of polite predictability. Its streets, narrow and cobbled, bore the faint smell of peat smoke and freshly turned soil, while the church spire cast a measured shadow over the gravestones below, each memorial carefully aligned as if to reinforce the village's cultivated equilibrium. Inspector Purbright, newly arrived and ever attentive to the minutiae of social decorum, noted that this equilibrium had a subtle tremor. The squire's window, overlooking the graveyard, ordinarily polished to a reflective sheen, bore a faint smear of dust, as though someone had leaned too closely or wiped too nervously. It was in itself a trivial blemish, but in Netherby, trivialities were rarely so innocent. Purbright's attention, as always, was drawn less to the ostensible disturbance than to the human response it provoked. Mrs. Weatherby, chair of the parish committee and guardian of the village's moral compass, greeted him with a measured smile that did not reach her eyes. Her hands, clasped so firmly that the knuckles showed pale, suggested a lifelong habit of suppressing small indignations. "Inspector," she said, in the clipped, precise tones of someone trained to manage both inquiry and impression, "we were not expecting you until after the committee meeting. But, of course, you are welcome." Her voice, while polite, carried a subtle undercurrent of disapproval. Disapproval not of him, but of circumstance. The committee meeting, held in the parish hall with its varnished benches and faintly musty hymnals, was nominally about the allocation of funds for repairs and flower displays. Yet it quickly became apparent that the window incident, though never explicitly named, cast a shadow over discussion. Every speaker prefaced their remarks with courteous qualifiers. "It may only be my humble opinion," or one would scarcely wish to cause alarm, yet the treasurer, Mr. Langley, a man of diminutive stature but considerable influence over ledgers, coughed delicately and adjusted his spectacles each time the conversation drifted near the window's unexplained disturbance. His eyes darted toward the squire, whose polite detachment and slight hauteur suggested both confidence and conscious concealment. Purbright observed the interactions with the quiet patience of a man accustomed to the subtle choreography of social tension. The villagers spoke in elliptical sentences, leaving their meaning half-formed, as if conscious that full disclosure would be socially dangerous. It was the small gestures, the almost imperceptible tightening of lips, the faint backward glance, that revealed the undercurrent of suspicion. When Mrs. Dalloway, the schoolmistress, offered her view that a stray breeze might have moved the latch, her voice bore the careful inflection of one protecting both her logic and her reputation. Purbright, noting the slight smudge of mud on her otherwise neat shoes, registered the contradiction, but said nothing. Tea was served in delicate cups, the steam curling like faint signals into the silent air. Conversation drifted toward mundane matters, the upcoming fete, the arrangement of pews, the repair of hedgerows. Yet, even in these banalities, moral judgment lurked. A compliment offered to the squire's meticulous lawn was balanced by an aside regarding the tendency of his gardener to work unofficial hours, implying a subtle critique of propriety. The vicar, perched near the window, smiled faintly at these exchanges, a connoisseur of village behavior, his amusement tempered by the awareness of underlying tensions. It was during this period of understated observation that Purbright noticed a small detail. The placement of the hymnals on the squire's side table was inconsistent with prior meetings, the volume slightly askew as though hastily arranged. The organist, a young man named Reeves, avoided eye contact when questioned, offering only a polite assertion that everything was in order. The minor dissonance, in Purbright's experience, was rarely trivial. A letter, arriving by hand in a neat envelope addressed to the vicar, was passed across the table with exaggerated care. No one opened it immediately. It was handled as though it might harbor both gossip and censure. The handwriting was precise, the flourishes careful, suggesting an author of education and deliberate intent. Purbright, noting the tremor in Mrs. Weatherby's hand as she adjusted her cuff, inferred the letter's potential to unsettle, however gently, the village's social balance. By late afternoon, the sun cast long shadows across the gravestones visible through the window, illuminating a faintly reflective surface that seemed almost to watch the committee as it debated. Purbright's gaze lingered on this reflection, considering not the pain itself, but the network of subtle observations, evasions, and polite half-truths surrounding it. Each movement, each micro-expression, seemed laden with latent significance, as though the village were communicating in a language of hints and careful concealments. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Weatherby rose with a polite sigh. She thanked Purbright for his attention and assured him that all minor matters will be attended to, though her glance toward the squire suggested reservations unspoken. The inspector, remaining seated for a moment, reflected on the pattern of glances, gestures, and faintly contradictory statements he had catalogued. In the quiet that followed, a small, almost imperceptible shift occurred. A shadow passed across the gravestone nearest the window, catching Reeves's attention, though he quickly looked away. Purbright noted the subtle hesitation, the tiny disruption in the village's otherwise impeccable composure, and recognized it as the first faint hint of a question that would unfold in layers of whispered suspicion and carefully veiled inquiry. The morning sun filtered reluctantly through the tall sash windows of Netherby Parish office, illuminating a desk cluttered with ledgers, hymnals, and a small stack of letters awaiting attention. The post, delivered with the village's customary punctuality, contained more than ordinary correspondence. Among the routine requests for garden repairs and subscriptions to church funds were 3 letters, anonymous in origin, written in a precise, almost archly formal hand. Inspector Purbright, having arrived to review the parish records, recognized immediately that these letters were intended less to communicate than to provoke. Their phrasing, polite to the verge of condescension, carried the subtle insistence of moral judgment, each sentence a measured poke at the veneer of propriety in which Netherby had long cloaked itself. The first letter, modest in size, expressed concern over unauthorized disturbances in the squire's window, a phrase both precise and faintly theatrical. It hinted, with commendable restraint, that certain parishioners might be observed engaging in behavior contrary to the community's expected standards. Purbright, examining the faintly smudged ink, noted the careful slant and the flourish on the signature, which was, in truth, nothing more than an elaborate squiggle. The absence of a name, he mused, did not diminish its intent. Rather, it magnified the letter's potency, for the unknown always exerts more pressure on conscience than the known. Over tea in the vicarage, Purbright discussed the letters with the vicar himself, whose mild amusement concealed a faint trace of concern. "We receive all manner of observations," the vicar said, placing the cup upon its saucer with a soft clink. "Some are well-intentioned, others less so. Still, it is the tone rather than the content that often proves instructive." Purbright inclined his head, noting the careful choice of words. In Netherby, phrasing was never innocent. It was a tool wielded by those who understood the social economy of hints, omissions, and indirect reproach. The vicar's observations were interrupted by the entrance of Mrs. Weatherby, chair of the parish committee, whose expression blended polite civility with a measure of private disapproval. She accepted the letters with a slight hesitation, as if they carried a burden beyond their physical weight. "It is unusual," she said, her voice measured, "for concerns to be aired in this manner. One would hope the parish could manage minor indiscretions with discretion." Purbright noted the carefully measured pause, the implied accusation directed not at the letter writer, but at the recipients, whose reputations might now tremble under the weight of unseen scrutiny. The second letter, in a slightly different hand, concerned itself with nocturnal visitations near the graveyard. Though nothing overtly illicit was claimed, the subtle suggestion of impropriety elicited an immediate, if discreet, tension among those present. The third letter, shorter and terser, hinted at possible collusion between certain villagers and the squire, a statement so delicate in its wording that any direct accusation was carefully avoided. Purbright, observing Mrs. Weatherby's faintly pursed lips and the vicar's light adjustment of his spectacles, recognized that the letters had already begun to shift the equilibrium of the parish, if only slightly, and perhaps imperceptibly to those who clung to habit and routine. The inspector's attention, however, was drawn not only to the content but to the materiality of the letters. Each envelope bore subtle signs of handling, creases at the corners, faint fingerprints, and the occasional smudge of ink. These were not mistakes, he concluded, but signals. The author sought to be noticed, yet remain concealed, a duality which, in a village like Netherby, is a strategy as old as its cobbled streets. Over the course of several hours, he cross-referenced the penmanship with known hands, the librarian, the organist, even the schoolmistress, but found nothing definitive. Each potential culprit, when observed, carried a practiced air of innocence. Conversation turned inevitably to the squire, whose absence from the morning deliberations was explained with a litany of minor obligations. Purbright noted with discreet attention the various glances cast toward the window overlooking the graveyard, a librarian's quick look, a faint frown from the verger, an almost imperceptible tightening of the vicar's lips. In each, there was a trace of concern, the slight unease that accompanies the possibility of reputational harm. The letters had acted as catalysts, provoking subtle shifts in posture, tone, and attention. By midday, the inspector wandered the small office, leafing through minutes of past meetings, noting the consistent pattern of polite disagreement, cautious praise, and minor corrections, all designed to preserve outward harmony while managing internal friction. He reflected on the paradox of Netherby, a village that prided itself on moral rectitude yet thrived on the silent monitoring of neighbors, a society in which gossip and discretion coexisted in delicate balance. As he replaced the letters in their modest stack, a small anomaly caught his eye. One envelope, previously unnoticed, had a faint tear along its flap, suggesting hurried insertion into the post rather than careful handling. It was trivial, almost laughably so, but in Netherby, trivialities were rarely meaningless. Purbright considered, in silence, the subtle implication. The letter may have been delivered in haste, or perhaps under duress, hinting at a motivation stronger than simple mischief. The quiet shift in his attention, the acknowledgement that even minor deviations might conceal a carefully masked purpose, set the tone for the inquiries to come. Outside, the late afternoon sun draped long shadows across the gravestones visible from the office window. Purbright, gazing at the gentle sway of a hawthorn branch against the backdrop of polished glass, sensed a faint unease in the otherwise ordered world. The letters, seemingly innocuous, had already begun their work, unsettling schedules, provoking whispered conjectures, and introducing the first almost imperceptible fracture in Netherby's carefully managed calm. He made a note to visit those mentioned, not with accusation, but with the quiet patience necessary to observe subtle reactions, gestures, and omissions. The quiet was no longer merely background, it had become a vessel for meaning. The parish hall, normally a sanctuary of routine decorum, assumed an air of subtle tension as Inspector Purbright entered for the midweek committee inspection. The benches, polished to a faint gleam, reflected the light from the tall sash windows, one of which, the squire's window overlooking the graveyard, remained conspicuously smudged from the prior disturbance. Purbright noted without comment that the arrangement of chairs subtly suggested the hierarchy of influence among committee members. Mrs. Weatherby at the head, the treasurer, Mr. Langley, slightly off to one side, and the vicar stationed strategically near the window, ostensibly to observe the proceedings, but perhaps also the participants. The balance of authority and subtle rivalry in this seating plan was as precise as the arrangement of hymnals on the lectern, and Purbright's keen eye caught every hint of deviation. Discussion commenced with measured civility, ostensibly regarding routine repairs and parish expenditures. Mrs. Weatherby spoke first, her words formal and courteous, though her phrasing contained a hint of reproach aimed at the committee's prior neglect of minor duties. "It is, of course, a minor oversight," she began, "yet one must remain vigilant lest these small lapses encourage larger indiscretions." Her eyes flicked toward Mr. Langley, who, adjusting his spectacles, made no effort to disguise the faint twitch of irritation at the implication. Purbright, seated near the doorway, recorded the interplay of glances, pauses, and clipped affirmations, the language of polite accountability and the subtle theatre of public censure. The squire, absent from the previous meeting, made a brief appearance, offering apologies for prior commitments, though his tone was meticulously measured, suggesting that his conscience remained untroubled. He observed the discussion with a slight tilt of the head, nodding at moments calculated to convey interest, while carefully omitting any comment that might expose knowledge of the earlier window disturbance. Purbright, noting the polished gleam of the squire's shoes and the precise placement of his cufflinks, inferred a man adept at masking both anxiety and amusement, a duality the village understood only in whispered conjecture. Conversation, ostensibly focused on the eye, inspection of window panes and memorial plaques, drifted imperceptibly toward the letters that had recently arrived at the parish office. Mrs. Weatherby, with an elegant gesture, produced the correspondence, careful to maintain neutrality while signaling that their contents merited attention. The committee members, in response, exhibited varying degrees of discomfort. The organist, Mr. Reeves, a faint blush coloring his pale complexion, the librarian, Miss Cartwright, a discreet tightening of her lips, and Mr. Langley, whose cough betrayed both irritation and suppressed curiosity. Each reaction, subtle though it was, provided Purbright with a nuanced understanding of latent allegiances, grudges, and fears of reputational harm. The vicar interjected at intervals, his words measured, his tone calm yet subtly illuminating fault lines within the group. One must weigh the consequences of attention, he suggested, lest minor curiosities evolve into unnecessary scandal. The statement, while innocuous, provoked a careful scrutiny among the committee members, each interpreting it according to personal anxieties and prior grievances. Purbright, silently recording the patterns of response, recognized the delicate choreography of etiquette, restraint, and moral signaling that governed village interactions. Attention returned to the squire's window. Purbright, moving to inspect the sill and frame, observed minute traces of mud and an almost imperceptible scratch near the latch. These trivialities, in most contexts, would be insignificant. Yet in Netherby, where minor blemishes on public or private property were treated as matters of both civic and moral concern, they assumed disproportionate significance. The committee, observing Purbright's scrutiny, maintained a careful posture of neutrality, each member balancing curiosity with the social imperative of discretion. Mrs. Wetheb, whispering a polite inquiry, suggested that the maintenance staff might have overlooked some cleaning, though her glance toward the vicar betrayed uncertainty. A minor debate ensued regarding the placement of memorial plaques and the preservation of inscriptions. While ostensibly a discussion of historical propriety, it carried undercurrents of rivalry, the choice of font, the hierarchy of names, the order of acknowledgement. Purbright, noting the subtle corrections offered by various members, recognized the manner in which petty rivalries could be framed as civic diligence, each correction serving as both moral assertion and social positioning. The organist's nervous fidgeting, the librarian's careful rephrasing, and the treasurer's slight huff of impatience all conveyed a web of hidden resentments, each carefully moderated to avoid overt conflict. By late afternoon, the committee adjourned, leaving Purbright with a quiet collection of observations. The window, the letters, the carefully monitored reactions, all hinted at undercurrents of disquiet beneath the village's seemingly imperturbable surface. Yet it was a small, almost imperceptible detail that drew his attention. The verger, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the meeting, lingered near the doorway, a faint crease in his brow betraying an awareness he did not voice. Purbright, noting the slight hesitation in the verger's departure, recorded it with care, recognizing that sometimes the unspoken, rather than the stated, carried the greatest weight in the quiet arithmetic of suspicion. As Purbright left the hall, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravestones visible through the squire's window. He paused, noting how the reflection of the treetops trembled slightly on the glass, and how a distant crow's call punctuated the otherwise measured quiet. In that subtle interplay of HT and observation, he sensed the first faint tremor of a question, whether the village's meticulous civility could endure scrutiny, or whether even minor disturbances, letters, smudges, glanced hesitations, might unravel the delicate lattice of trust and reputation. It was a question the village would not yet acknowledge, but one that would, in due course, guide the inspector's inquiries with quiet precision. The late afternoon in Netherby carried the faint scent of peat smoke and drying autumn leaves, a detail that did little to distract from the village's quieter disturbances. Inspector Purbright, having completed the parish committee inspection, now undertook the slower, more intricate work of individual interviews. His method was simple yet effective: polite inquiry, observation of micro-expressions, and attention to what was deliberately omitted from speech. In a village such as this, it was rarely the words themselves that revealed intention, but the slight inflections, hesitations, and carefully modulated tone of genteel avoidance. His first call was upon Mrs. Dalloway, the schoolmistress, whose small terraced house bore an air of orderliness so exact that it seemed to discourage disorder both physical and moral. She welcomed him with tea and the faintest tremor of nervous hospitality. "I was at home, of course," she said, arranging sugar cubes with deliberate precision, attending to the morning's grading. "One scarcely leaves matters unfinished." Purbright's gaze, unobtrusive yet attentive, noted a smear of mud on the hem of her otherwise pristine skirt, a discrepancy she neither mentioned nor acknowledged. "A brief errand to the garden, perhaps?" he suggested lightly. Mrs. Dalloway's eyes widened fractionally before settling on a polite, measured denial, the faintest blush betraying an otherwise well-mannered misrepresentation. Next he visited Mr. Reeves, the organist, who maintained a posture of studied calm in the vicarage sitting-room. Reeves's fingers fidgeted, tapping occasionally on the edge of the side table, though his voice remained composed. "I might have passed near the graveyard," he admitted, carefully choosing each word, "though I assure you there was no disturbance intended. One's conscience can be unsettled by misinterpretation." The remark, delivered with impeccable propriety, conveyed both self-defense and an understated accusation that others might be less circumspect. Purbright recorded the subtle tension in his shoulders, the quick glance toward the vicar's portrait, and the faint lift of an eyebrow, indicators he knew of anxiety refracted through social conditioning. The librarian, Miss Cartwright, presented a different challenge. Politeness was her armor, precision her shield. She greeted Purbright with measured cordiality, guiding him to a chair with an almost imperceptible hesitation. "I can assure you, Inspector," she said, "that the letters and their implications are of no concern to me. Our records are intact, our procedures meticulous." Yet her fingers, idly tracing the edges of the ledgers, betrayed a small nervous tremor. Purbright, noting the slightest indentation of thumb on the corner of a page, inferred a minor but deliberate concealment, a hesitation not to lie but to reveal partial truth. Social propriety, he observed, could be as constraining as guilt itself. Each visit revealed a recurring pattern, civility laced with guarded anxiety, minor inconsistencies delivered with polite explanation, and a delicate calibration of truth and omission. These were small village dramas played on a scale measured in glances, silences, and half-uttered corrections. Conversations drifted to the squire and the recently disturbed window, yet none offered direct accusations. Instead, they spoke in elliptical references and formal hypotheticals, each sentence serving as both shield and probe. Purbright noted the meticulous attention paid to posture, voice, and gesture. Even the simplest phrase seemed calculated to preserve social equilibrium while hinting at moral judgment. In the schoolmistress's garden, a faintly broken branch caught his attention. "Ah," she said lightly, noticing his gaze, "the storm last night. One cannot control everything, even with careful pruning." Her voice implied more than horticultural concern, yet she left the implication to the inspector's discretion. In Netherby, natural events were frequently interpreted as analogies for social behavior, and small mishaps could be magnified into symbols of conduct or impropriety. Purbright, acknowledging the metaphor without comment, filed the observation among the minor anomalies, demanding future attention. Returning to the parish office, he reviewed his notes, traces of mud, misaligned hymnals, hurriedly delivered letters, anxious gestures, and polite evasions. Each element, trivial when isolated, collectively formed a lattice of potential significance. The inspector appreciated the quiet craftsmanship of these interactions. They revealed not overt malice, but the subtler interplay of reputational anxiety and moral vigilance. Netherby, in its seemingly unruffled surface, was a village capable of turning the smallest deviation into a ripple of concern and conjecture. A minor revelation emerged in the form of a comment from Mr. Langley, the treasurer, overheard as Purbright departed. "One ought not presume that absence absolves one from responsibility, even when appearances suggest otherwise." The phrase, delivered in clipped tones, was ostensibly about ledger accuracy, yet the timing and choice of words suggested awareness of the letters, the window, or both. Purbright, filing the remark alongside fidgeting, evasive, and anxious behavior observed earlier, recognized a subtle shift. The village's careful equilibrium was no longer entirely intact. As the sun lowered behind the gravestones visible from the office, casting elongated shadows across the cobbles, Purbright paused at the window. His gaze rested on the squire's reflection, the faint smudge of yesterday's disturbance still discernible in the afternoon light. A small movement, a figure briefly appearing and then retreating behind the yew hedge, was too fleeting to identify, yet it carried weight in the quiet arithmetic of suspicion. Purbright's attention, trained to detect micro-expression and minor anomaly, recognized the gesture for what it might signify, that the village's social calm, carefully curated, was beginning to fracture under the pressure of observation, letters, and unspoken conjecture. A question, nearly imperceptible yet insistent, had arisen: who watched, and what had they witnessed? Sunday arrived with the customary quietude of Netherby. the air faintly scented with peat and polished pews, and the sun slanting obliquely through the stained glass. The village seemed unchanged at first glance, yet Inspector Purbright, as always, noticed what was rarely acknowledged: the minute tension in posture, the careful alignment of glances, the discreet scrutiny of neighbors, and the almost imperceptible calculation behind each smile. Church, in Netherby, was as much a theatre of reputational vigilance as a place of worship, and every pew bore the weight of subtle expectation. Purbright observed the parishioners entering the nave with deliberate civility. Mrs. Weatherby arrived first, carrying her prayer book with an almost ceremonial precision. She took her customary seat near the front, ensuring that her line of sight encompassed both the squire's pew and the window above the graveyard, whose slight smear of dust remained faintly visible. Her expression was composed, yet the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth suggested unease. She adjusted her gloves with meticulous care, each movement hinting at a simultaneous desire for propriety and control over perceived disorder. The squire, arriving shortly after, offered a courteous nod to the vicar and committee members, a gesture at once deferential and calculated. He seated himself with impeccable posture, avoiding any contact with the adjacent pews save for a discreet glance toward the window. His hands, polished and precise, rested lightly on the cushion, conveying a sense of calm authority while revealing nothing of internal thought. Purbright noted how every movement was deliberate, measured, and socially defensive. It was an intricate choreography of observation, concealment, and subtly asserted influence. During the service, the vicar's sermon emphasized moral rectitude, patience, and the hazards of idle speculation. The words, though gentle in tone, carried an unspoken relevance. Congregants shifted slightly in their seats, glances exchanging meaning beneath polite attentiveness. One could almost hear in the silent spaces between sentences the social calculus of judgment being recalibrated. Who had observed what? Who might have overstepped? And who was conscious of being observed? Purbright, noting the faint pressure of hands on hymnals and the deliberate alignment of knees beneath the pews, catalogued each gesture as though it were a clue to human intent. Mrs. Dalloway, seated near the back, whispered a brief correction to the organist, who inclined his head with exaggerated compliance, producing a soft, hesitant note that harmonized yet faltered slightly. Purbright noted the exchange, minor in action, yet laden with undercurrents of subtle authority, embarrassment, and unspoken hierarchy. The parish, he reflected, existed not merely as a spiritual institution, but as a lattice of minor resentments and reputational anxieties, each carefully moderated and cloaked in civility. After the sermon, conversation in the vestry was conducted with polite circumspection. Observations of the squire's attentiveness, the minor smudge on the window, and the recent letters were all expressed in elliptical language. "It is curious," Mrs. Weatherby said lightly, "how small disturbances may occasion disproportionate reflection." Her glance toward the squire, though subtle, carried the weight of mild reproach. Mr. Langley, adjusting his spectacles, murmured agreement in tones carefully measured, while the organist shifted uneasily, glancing toward the shadows cast by the gravestones visible through the tall window. Each phrase, gesture, and hesitation was a calibrated signal, a carefully deployed device to protect or assert reputation without overt confrontation. Purbright's own remarks, offered in quiet, formal inquiry, elicited responses layered with hesitation, embellishment, and polite evasion. The parishioners' answers were technically truthful yet deliberately incomplete, revealing as much in their structure and cadence as in their content. When he asked casually whether anyone had seen unusual activity near the graveyard window, replies were precise yet indirect. "One cannot always observe everything, Inspector," Mrs. Weatherby said, her voice smooth, though one does attend to that which might compromise decorum. Each answer, seemingly benign, was a carefully constructed mirror of propriety, deflecting scrutiny while signaling awareness of potential transgression. By mid-afternoon, as the service concluded, Purbright lingered near the squire's window, noting the long shadows stretching across the gravestones. The congregation filed past with impeccable civility, yet in the alignment of glances, the slight hesitation in step, and the almost imperceptible adjustment of gloves and hats, he discerned tension, a minor detail. A faintly displaced hymn book, left intentionally or inadvertently by the organist, caught his attention. It was trivial in itself, Yet in Netherby, such deviations from established order often carried more meaning than overt statement. As the parish emptied, Purbright observed the squire pausing at the threshold, glancing once toward the window, then downward toward the recently disturbed flower beds. His expression was polite, almost bland, yet the slight narrowing of the eyes betrayed a measure of calculation. The inspector noted, too, the faint tremor in the hand of the verger as he adjusted the collection plates, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for fatigue. But in Netherby, fatigue rarely accounted for such minutiae. It was the kind of detail that spoke quietly yet insistently of watchfulness, of conscience, and of reputational anxiety. Purbright stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, allowing the shadows of the gravestones and yew trees to stretch across the churchyard. He paused to observe a single crow perched on a distant branch, silent yet keenly attentive. In that stillness he sensed a subtle shift. The villagers' cultivated calm, the web of civility, and the lattice of social expectation had begun to reveal fissures. Minor disturbances, lettered admonitions, and fleeting glances had begun their quiet work, and beneath the veneer of polite attendance, a silent question hovered, unresolved and insistent: who, among the ostensibly dutiful, had transgressed, and to what degree could the village sustain its delicate balance before the inevitable ripple of suspicion grew too large to ignore? The following afternoon brought an air of measured curiosity to Netherby, punctuated by the arrival of a visitor from a neighbouring county. Mr. Ainsworth, a distant cousin of the squire, disembarked from the infrequent village omnibus with a demeanour that suggested urban familiarity and just enough condescension to unsettle provincial equilibrium. Inspector Purbright, observing from the threshold of the parish hall, noted the almost imperceptible shift among committee members, a straightening of posture here, a slight tightening of lips there. In Netherby, strangers rarely arrived unremarked. Even the smallest gestures or introductions could ripple subtly through reputations and alliances. The visitor was formally received by Mrs. Weatherby, who executed the customary combination of warmth and reserve, her smile both measured and instructive. "We are honoured, Mr. Ainsworth," she said, gesturing to a polished set of chairs, "to accommodate your interests in our parish affairs." The compliment was precise, the tone carefully modulated, and beneath it lay the faintest trace of defensiveness. A hedged acknowledgement that outsiders might discern fissures the locals preferred remained invisible. The squire himself offered a courteous nod, allowing the cousin to seat himself with an air of mild proprietorship. Purbright observed these interactions with quiet attention, noting the subtle interplay of recognition, deference, and latent rivalry. Conversation commenced with nominal pleasantries: weather, travel, the beauty of the parish grounds, but even the lightest topics bore undercurrents of tension. Mr. Ainsworth, in polite yet pointed fashion, remarked on the clarity of the gravestone inscriptions and the meticulous upkeep of flower beds. His tone implied both admiration and mild critique, subtly highlighting the village's imperfections without overt reproach. Mrs. Weatherby, in response, tilted her head and adjusted her gloves, a gesture that conveyed both attentiveness and the faint sure of social defence. Purbright noted the interplay of glances, the organist's quick sidewise look, the librarian's faintly raised eyebrows, the treasurer's discreet clearing of the throat, all indicators of subtle recalibration in the presence of a perceived evaluator. The visitor's interest soon turned to the squire's window overlooking the graveyard. "A remarkable vantage," he observed, "though one might wonder if it invites more observation than is prudent." The words, innocent in surface meaning, carried insinuation. The squire's posture stiffened imperceptibly, while Mrs. Weatherby's hands, previously relaxed, were now neatly folded in front of her. Purbright noted the careful management of expression, polite curiosity masquerading as concern, and concern simultaneously tempered by the threat of reputational exposure. Even minor attention from an outsider seemed capable of unsettling the carefully orchestrated village theatre. Mr. Ainsworth, seated with one leg crossed and a notebook placed unobtrusively upon his knee, began to ask about parish routines, the recent letters, and the seemingly trivial disturbance of the window. Each question, formal and indirect, elicited responses precisely measured to convey competence and propriety while avoiding disclosure of anxiety or suspicion. Yet micro-gestures betrayed underlying tension, a slight backward tilt of the head, a brief tightening of the lips, or the almost imperceptible glance toward another committee member. Purbright, cataloguing these subtleties, recognized a familiar dynamic. The visitor had unwittingly become a catalyst, coaxing into the light the faint anxieties and social hierarchies that the villagers had long cultivated. During tea, offered with the customary precision of the parish committee, small details emerged. Mr. Ainsworth remarked on the polished surface of the organ keys, the alignment of hymnals, and the apparent order of the minutes. Each observation, while superficially benign, invited unspoken evaluation: who maintained appearances, who concealed minor lapses, and who was complicit in oversight. Purbright noted the almost imperceptible exchange of glances between Mrs. Weatherby and the vicar, a subtle negotiation of propriety and authority. In Netherby, even a conversation about housekeeping could function as a medium for revealing latent hierarchy and social tension. As the visitor prepared to depart, he paused near the window, adjusting his hat and briefly examining the reflection in the glass. Purbright observed a faint smudge at the sill, small, almost trivial, but the visitor's deliberate inspection, and the slight nod accompanying it, suggested recognition of significance. The squire offered an air of nonchalance, yet his hand rested lightly on the window frame, an almost imperceptible assertion of possession and control. Mrs. Weatherby, seated nearby, adjusted her gloves and cleared her throat with precise timing, conveying subtle disapproval without confrontation. Purbright, observing the departure, reflected on the cumulative effect of the visitor's presence. A minor tremor of suspicion had begun to ripple through the village. Small gestures, polite corrections, and faint anxieties coalesced into a pattern of subtle unrest. Even the act of an outsider noting the window or the gravestones had introduced a question previously dormant: what knowledge had been concealed, and by whom? The quiet watchfulness of Netherby, its lattice of civility and moral restraint, had been lightly disturbed, leaving an opening for observation, conjecture, and the slow, deliberate unfolding of truth. As he stepped into the late afternoon light, Purbright's gaze returned to the graveyard, where shadows stretched long across the stones. A figure, almost imperceptible, moved behind the yew hedge, pausing to glance toward the village hall before vanishing. The movement was fleeting, easily dismissed, yet in Purbright's mind it carried weight. A silent question had emerged, subtle but insistent, poised to guide his inquiries into the heart of Netherby's quietly unsettled social order. The parish office, always tidy yet burdened with a faint scent of dusted books and polished oak, bore a small stack of the latest parish newsletters. Inspector Purbright arrived mid-morning, notebook in hand, intent on examining the subtle patterns of language, omissions, and emphasis within the printed pages. In Netherby, the newsletter was more than a vehicle for announcements. It was a tool of social influence, a ledger of propriety, and a mechanism for managing reputations with the delicacy of a watchmaker adjusting springs. Purbright's first observation was immediate. The report on the window overlooking the graveyard was conspicuously absent. Where one might have expected even a cursory mention, there was instead a brief note praising the flower beds and the regularity of pew arrangement. It was phrased with courteous detachment: all parish properties continue to reflect the care and attention of our devoted residents. The statement, while outwardly neutral, carried the weight of deliberate omission. The editor had chosen to ignore an event that had stirred mild unrest, preserving a surface calm that masked underlying tensions. Mrs. Weatherby, who entered shortly thereafter to oversee routine clerical matters, adjusted her gloves with deliberate precision upon seeing Purbright. "We endeavour," she said in clipped, careful tones, "to ensure that the parish chronicle reflects the decorum and order one hopes to maintain." Her eyes, however, flicked toward the newsletter with a faint hesitation, betraying concern for the selection of phrasing and the subtle implications it carried. Purbright noted the nuance. She did not object overtly to the omission, yet the slight crease in her brow suggested awareness that words, even when carefully constructed, could wield influence both intended and unintended. Purbright leafed through the remainder of the newsletter. The editorial notes praised committee diligence and subtly commended certain families for punctuality, neatness, and attentiveness. By contrast, a minor critique was directed toward one household for occasionally overlooking the small details that preserve our parish's appearance, phrasing so careful that it avoided direct accusation, while still signaling social censure. The interplay of praise and discreet reproach, carefully balanced, revealed the village's hierarchy, alliances, and minor resentments. It was social arithmetic rendered in print, invisible to the casual eye but legible to the observant. The organist, Mr. Reeves, entered quietly, attempting to appear absorbed in the filing of sheet music. His glance, however, lingered on the newsletter, and a brief tightening of his lips betrayed discomfort at the subtle references within. "The Chronicle is accurate," he said, in tones that were courteous but uneven, as though he were asserting innocence while also acknowledging the possibility of interpretation against him. Purbright, noting the alignment of shoulders, the brief flick of eyes toward the squire's office and the delicate modulation of voice, catalogued the signs of minor anxiety that had begun to propagate quietly through the parish community. Miss Cartwright, the librarian, arrived shortly thereafter, carrying a small ledger. Her examination of the newsletter was cursory, yet the faint pause before her signature on the ledger, the micro-adjustment of spectacles, and the slight tug at her scarf indicated attentive awareness of implications. Each member of the parish, Purbright observed, had internalized the newsletter's subtle hierarchies and warnings. It was as much a tool of moral observation as it was of communication. He made a careful note. Even minor textual emphasis could provoke measured anxiety and recalibrate social behavior. Conversation, when it occurred, was conducted with the customary polish. Mrs. Weatherby commented on the encouraging attendance at committee meetings, while Mr. Langley, adjusting his spectacles, noted the ledger updates with polite precision. All remarks were circumspect, layered with implication and delicate self-restraint. A single misaligned paragraph in the newsletter, a commendation of one household immediately followed by a vague remark about overlooked detail in another, generated a subtle ripple of glances and faint coughs. Purbright, observing from the corner of the room, understood that these micro-responses were the true narrative, revealing the silent calculations each parishioner performed regarding reputation, loyalty, and moral authority. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had catalogued the newsletter's structure, phrasing, and omissions. He noticed in particular a faintly inconsistent date at the bottom of one page, a minor typographical error almost certainly overlooked in editing. In Netherby, such trivialities could suggest either oversight or intentional redirection. The ambiguity, he reflected, was itself significant. The village relied on subtle cues to navigate moral and social hierarchies, and even minor discrepancies might carry disproportionate interpretive weight. As Purbright prepared to leave, he observed the squire entering the office, pausing briefly beside the newsletter before offering a courteous nod. His eyes lingered on the omitted window reference, the slight smudge along the glass reflecting the afternoon light, yet he said nothing. The act of recognition without comment, the quiet acknowledgement of detail, suggested tacit awareness and perhaps a restrained complicity. Outside, the long shadows cast by the churchyard yews stretched across the cobbles, and the faint movement of a figure behind the gravestone suggested that Netherby's equilibrium, though outwardly serene, remained subtly unsettled. The chapter concluded with a whisper of uncertainty: who observed and interpreted, and what minor discrepancy might unravel the carefully maintained lattice of social decorum. The following morning brought a measured quiet to Netherby, as if the village itself were preparing to observe the inspector at work. Inspector Purbright, notebook in hand, resolved to engage in a series of discreet conversations designed to elicit observation rather than confession. In a place where propriety governed both speech and gesture, the unspoken often carried more weight than the spoken, and the careful manipulation of politeness could reveal undercurrents of intent more clearly than direct interrogation. Purbright's first call was upon Mr. Langley, the treasurer, a man of diminutive stature yet formidable attention to minor details. He received the inspector with a polite bow, gesturing to a neatly arranged desk where ledgers were aligned with precise regularity. "Inspector," Langley said, voice composed yet tinged with restrained curiosity, "I trust your investigations are proceeding according to local custom and discretion?" The phrasing was deliberate, an acknowledgement of oversight framed in the language of civility. Purbright, noting the slight hesitation in Langley's hand as he adjusted his spectacles, recognized the subtle tension between duty and self-protection. The conversation drifted toward the letters and the window disturbance. Langley spoke carefully, avoiding direct accusation, yet each statement was punctuated by faint inflections, an elevated tone here, a micro-pause there, that suggested latent apprehension. "One must always balance observation with restraint," he said, lest minor concerns assume disproportionate significance. The remark, polite and formally structured, hinted at awareness without admitting personal knowledge, the village's preferred method of maintaining equilibrium while acknowledging possible impropriety. Purbright made note of Langley's gaze, which lingered slightly toward the window, then toward a ledger page that bore marginal notations in faint pencil. From there, Purbright walked the short distance to Miss Cartwright's library, where the librarian presided over shelves of meticulously arranged volumes. Her posture was impeccable, hands folded neatly before her, yet the micro-adjustment of her spectacles and the faint crease in her brow betrayed attentiveness to both content and perception. "Inspector," she said, voice smooth, "you will find our records, like our reputation, carefully maintained. There is little that escapes notice." The statement, while formally accurate, carried an unspoken caveat: awareness of oversight need not equate to disclosure. Purbright, observing the precise alignment of her ledger entries, the subtle displacement of books near the window, and the careful modulation of voice, catalogued the gestures as social signals of both vigilance and discretion. His next visit was to the squire, who received him in the drawing-room with the customary mixture of cordiality and hauteur. Polished furniture, faint scent of leather, and a small, precisely positioned blotter conveyed both order and authority. "Inspector," said the squire, inclining his head, "your attention to minor occurrences is, as always, appreciated. One trusts that in observing the window, you found no cause for undue concern." The phrasing, courteous yet insinuative, suggested confidence in concealment, the familiar tension between appearance and private knowledge. Purbright, noting the slight lift of the squire's eyebrow and the subtle clench of a hand resting on the blotter, inferred both reassurance and guarded awareness. Throughout the morning, Purbright observed a consistent pattern: civility as armor, deliberate omissions, and the careful management of micro-gestures. Each conversation, though superficially polite, revealed layers of anxiety, moral vigilance, and reputational preservation. Minor inconsistencies, the faint misalignment of ledger pages, the subtle adjustment of gloves or spectacles, became indicators of concern and attention to perceived scrutiny. In Netherby, the veneer of propriety functioned as a latticework for moral surveillance, and even the smallest deviation could transmit a ripple of apprehension throughout the social network. A subtle shift occurred when Purbright returned to the parish office to review the day's correspondence. A new letter, unremarkable in size but notable for the deliberate slant of handwriting and a faint smudge at the bottom of the page, lay atop the stack. Its tone was formally courteous, yet the phrasing implied observation. "One hopes that continued vigilance will preserve the order and dignity of our parish." The author remained unnamed, the message indirect, yet its presence was sufficient to provoke reconsideration of recent minor anomalies. The misplaced hymnals, the smudged window, and the subtle gestures he had catalogued in conversation. Purbright's attention lingered on the slight tremor of the organist's hands noted earlier, the faint hesitation of the librarian's speech, and the careful, measured responses of the squire. Each represented a potential point of insight, a minor fissure in the village's carefully maintained decorum. The cumulative effect of observations, letters, and understated gestures suggested an unspoken network of watchfulness and self-regulation, in which even the most mundane behaviors carried interpretive weight. By late afternoon, as shadows stretched across the churchyard visible from the office window, Purbright reflected on the delicate arithmetic of village interaction. The lattice of civility, observation, and restraint had begun to show faint signs of tension, each polite gesture containing a kernel of anxiety or moral calculation. A figure briefly appeared near the yew hedge, then vanished, pausing just long enough to cast a subtle glance toward the office. The movement, small yet deliberate, suggested awareness of scrutiny and perhaps complicity or observation of others. In the quiet unfolding of Netherby's social machinery, a question lingered, which minor deviation, unremarkable to the casual observer, might reveal the hidden truth beneath a lattice of propriety, restraint, and silent suspicion. The morning air in Netherby carried the faint scent of wet leaves and polished wood, a backdrop of calm that belied the subtle agitation Purbright had come to recognize in the village. He began his day in the parish office, reviewing correspondence, committee notes, and the recent newsletters. Each document, he observed, contained not only facts but carefully measured silences, omissions, and phrasing that hinted at the undercurrents of reputation, disapproval, and cautious surveillance. The parish, he reflected, functioned as a latticework of minor anxieties, each carefully interlinked, and it was within these interstices that small deviations, letters, gestures, or smudges, carried disproportionate weight. Purbright first noted the letter from yesterday, still resting atop the desk, its faint smudge at the bottom of the page catching the morning light. Though courteous in tone, the letter implied observation. May one trust that the parish's attentions remained vigilant and orderly? Its indirect admonition resonated against the backdrop of the prior letters, the window smudge, and the minor irregularities he had observed in ledger margins, hymnals, and personal gestures. Each detail, while trivial in isolation, now suggested a cumulative awareness that someone, perhaps more than one, watched, recorded, and interpreted the minutiae of Netherby's carefully maintained civility. His attention turned to the committee minutes, where subtle inconsistencies emerged. The scheduling of repairs and the ordering of hymnals contained slight divergences from prior entries, dates adjusted by a day here, a name transposed there. Though unremarkable on first reading, Purbright noted that such small alterations could signal either oversight or deliberate redirection, a mechanism by which reputations were preserved or subtly questioned. The treasurer, the organist, and the librarian were all implicated indirectly, through minor discrepancies in their respective records, yet none had spoken of them. Silence in Netherby was as potent a vehicle as gossip or admonition. He called upon Mrs. Weatherby shortly thereafter, under the pretext of reviewing the office ledger. Her composure was impeccable, gloves adjusted, posture straight, voice even. Yet her gaze, when it lingered on a specific line of ledger notes, betrayed a flicker of concern. "Inspector," she said, voice formally courteous, "you observe matters most meticulously. One must, of course, balance attention with discretion." The phrasing, carefully neutral, hinted simultaneously at approval and mild reproach. Purbright recorded the glance toward the window, the small tightening of lips, and the deliberate pause before she continued. Each minor gesture was itself a pattern, revealing the interplay of anxiety and social calculation. The organist, Mr. Reeves, was next. His hands fidgeted unconsciously as he spoke, though the words remained composed. "One may hope," he said softly, "that vigilance does not descend into over-interpretation." The faint inflection at the close suggested he feared both the consequences of being observed and the possibility of misjudging the actions of others. Purbright observed the fleeting glance toward the gravestones visible through the window. Noting a pattern, each individual's attention was drawn, almost reflexively, to the site of minor disturbance, a silent locus of moral and social evaluation. Miss Cartwright, in contrast, exhibited careful restraint. Her gestures were controlled, her ledger entries exact. Yet the brief hesitation before initialing a page, the subtle furrow of her brow, and the measured pace of her speech betrayed internal calculation. Even in meticulous action, there existed evidence of concern that minor misalignments, overlooked notes, or smudges could be interpreted as moral or procedural lapses. Purbright, quietly noting these patterns, reflected on the lattice of observation through which the village enforced its proprieties, and how small deviations could accumulate into significant social insight. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had begun to chart connections among gestures, letters, and discrepancies. A faint repetition emerged. Certain ledger adjustments coincided with committee meetings, minor smudges appeared near the gravestone-facing window, and the organist and librarian each displayed subtle signs of anticipatory attention. These patterns, unremarkable individually, collectively hinted at an awareness of scrutiny, perhaps even deliberate concealment of actions or knowledge. Netherby, he concluded, was not merely a village of civility, it was a community in which observation and reputation were intertwined with precision, and minor signals could carry the weight of judgment. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the parish office window, casting shadows across ledgers and letters, Purbright noted a small detail, a faint indentation O. The desk, as if a letter or note had been hastily removed. Its position suggested someone had examined the letters earlier, then returned to conceal or misplace evidence of observation. It was trivial, yet in Netherby trivialities often spoke volumes. The quiet arithmetic of gestures, glances, and omissions had produced a single persistent question. Who among the parishioners had assumed the role of silent observer, and what knowledge did they guard so carefully beneath the veneer of propriety? Netherby awoke to a faint chill that seemed to sharpen the village's habitual precision. Inspector Purbright, aware that his observations were approaching a cumulative clarity, walked the cobbled lanes with measured steps, cataloguing minor details he had previously noted only peripherally: the alignment of flower pots, the slight smudge along the squire's window, and the subtle tension in gestures as villagers greeted one another. Each observation, though trivial in isolation, formed threads in a lattice of behavioral patterns, gradually revealing the underlying network of vigilance, self-restraint, and quiet anxiety. Purbright began the day with a final visit to the parish office, reviewing the letters, ledgers, and newsletters once more. His gaze lingered on the indentation he had noticed yesterday, faint but deliberate, as if someone had scanned the correspondence, before returning it in a manner intended to obscure their action. The squire's absence during this review was notable. His usual attentiveness had been replaced by a faint echo of presence, detectable only through the meticulous arrangement of blotters and desk implements. Purbright, noting the subtle alignment of items and the residual smudge of prior handling, inferred that the squire, or another party with access, had acted with deliberate discretion, mindful of both propriety and perception. Mrs. Weatherby arrived shortly thereafter, offering her usual polite greeting, gloves adjusted and posture impeccable. "Inspector," she said, voice even and measured, "one hopes your examination finds the parish in satisfactory order." There was a hint of concern in the cadence, a slight modulation that suggested awareness of unresolved matters. Purbright, seated opposite her, noted the brief pause before she continued, the subtle shift in weight as she leaned slightly toward the desk, and the delicate adjustment of her scarf. Each movement was a microcosm of Netherby's social vigilance, revealing the interplay of apprehension and the imperative to maintain appearances. The inspector's conversation with Mr. Langley followed, framed around ledger entries and the timing of minor repairs. Langley's diction was polite and precise, yet a faint tension in his shoulders suggested an awareness of scrutiny, beyond mere procedural oversight. "One does endeavor to preserve consistency," he remarked, "though occasionally human error may intrude despite one's best intentions." The phrase, formally restrained, conveyed both acknowledgement and subtle self-protection. Purbright, observing a slight shift of eyes toward the window and the squire's office, catalogued the gesture as evidence of attentiveness tempered by the fear of reputational consequence. Later, Purbright encountered Miss Cartwright and Mr. Reeves near the vestry. Their polite, measured conversation revolved around cataloguing and organ maintenance, yet the subtext was evident in the fleeting glances toward the gravestone-facing window and the faint pauses before response. Each minor hesitation, every calculated syllable, was a carefully managed signal of awareness and internal calculation. Purbright noted that the village's lattice of civility functioned precisely as intended. Small actions revealed information while preserving outward propriety, and minor gestures carried weight far beyond their apparent significance. By mid-afternoon, Purbright returned to the squire's drawing room where he found the occupant attending to the ledger with customary care. "Inspector," said the squire, inclining his head in measured acknowledgement, "your attention to detail is, as always, most commendable." His tone suggested both civility and restrained amusement, a signal that he recognized Purbright's gradual assembling of subtle evidence. Purbright, noting the precise alignment of blotters and pens, the faint smudge at the edge of the desk, and the deliberate positioning of correspondence, inferred not defiance, but careful management of information and perception. A minor revelation occurred when the squire, with a polite glance toward the window, mentioned the verger's recent diligence in arranging hymnals and managing pew alignment. The comment, seemingly innocuous, drew attention to a pattern previously noted by the inspector, small precise acts that reflected both conscientiousness and the latent anxieties induced by observation. Purbright recognized the significance of such minor acknowledgments. They served as